Hey there. Welcome back to the fourth video in my 5-part series on project leadership. It's good to have you with me. You know, I could do this alone with no one watching. I probably would. But it's way more fun to share it. And I really appreciate that you're watching. Please leave me a comment below and tell me what you think. I'm Dave Gowell, and I've been leading projects for over 40 years and teaching others how to lead projects for more than 20. I don't know about you, but I think projects are incredibly interesting and exciting and fun. I'd love to tell you more about it. If you haven't seen the first 3 videos in this series, you might find it beneficial to go back and watch them first, because this session will make a lot more sense if you do. At the very least, go back and watch the previous video called The 5 Parts of a Project before this one, because these two are especially interconnected. In this video, I'll be talking about the 5 steps that each project has to go through. In fact, just about everything you do will go through these same 5 steps. That's why I call them the 5 steps of progress. In the previous video, we talked about the 5 parts of every project. If you remember, the third part was when. When will we start? And when will we finish? Time is very important when you lead projects. As we proceed through the life of any project, we will naturally have to do certain things at certain times. That's because projects are a thing, and everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Every life has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So every project also has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Since every project is different, the exact things we have to do will vary greatly from project to project. But the kinds of things we'll have to do at the beginning of any project will be very similar to the kinds of things we'll have to do at the beginning of every project. And the kinds of things that we'll do at the end of a project will be very different from the kinds of things we did at the beginning. They'll also be very similar to the kinds of things we'll have to do at the end of every other project. And in the middle of the project, when most of the actual work is done, we'll find that we're doing a few specific things over and over and over again. And these few kinds of things will be very similar in almost every other project. Just like with the 5 parts of a project, we could divide these activities into 4 or 5 or 6 or even more different kinds of activities. But I still love the number 5. And as it happens, other project managers often divide project activities into 5 types. For example, PMI calls them the 5 process groups and calls them initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. I use different words. We both mean the same thing. By the way, did you notice PMI needed 20 syllables to name the 5 process groups? They must buy their syllables at Costco. If you watched video number 2, Project Management Drives Me Crazy, you know how I feel about using more syllables than you really need to. I got it down to, how many syllables do you think? Come on now, what's my favorite number? That's right, 5. 5 simple syllables. I call the 5 steps of progress see, plan, act, steer, and end. You can see these 5 steps in every example of progress you examine. Let's make up a story about doing a very simple task, like driving to work or to school. Step 1. In our mind, we see ourselves at work or school. That's where we want to be in half an hour. We can see we're not there now. It's 10 miles away. We decide to do something about it. Step 2, We need a plan to get there. We could plan to walk or ride a bike or jump on a skateboard. Hmm. Let's take a car instead. Let's say we've been there many times before and we already have a plan for exactly how to get there. We plan to back down our street and turn south on 606. We plan to take 606 to Little Mill and take that straight to Highway 55, then north all the way to work. And we'll be there. Step 3. Now we act. We get our keys, leave the house, get in the car, and start moving. So far, so good. In the beginning, acting is the easiest part. Step 4. But suddenly, look out! We have to steer. There's a trash can at the end of the driveway. We have to quickly steer around to avoid hitting it. Whew, that was a close one. Then we steer our car down to Little Mill. But oh no, they're doing some construction on Little Mill. There's a detour. We have to steer again. We have to steer in a different direction than we planned on. We have to mentally make a new revised plan. So we steer in a different way and we go to Grant. Then we use that to go to Delsey Drive. We go north and get on Little Mill that way. Our plan was to go straight up the highway to the exit. But now that we're there, we find it's not that simple. For example, we have to steer around slower cars and trucks. We have to slow down and steer around some big potholes. And we have to stop and wait for some totally unexpected things to get out of our way. In fact, almost the entire time we're acting, we're also constantly steering. Eventually, we get to work or to school, which is where we saw ourselves and where we planned to go, but the trip didn't go exactly as planned, did it? That's okay. We're 99% of the way there, but we can't stop yet. Step 5, we still have to end our drive properly. We can't just leave our car right in front of the entrance. People wouldn't like that. We have to pull our car into a legal parking space so it's not in the way of other drivers, and so we don't get a ticket. We park between the lines. We shut off the engine. We grab our laptop and water bottle and all the other stuff we need.
Remote control, the ashtray, the paddle game, and the remote control. That's all I need. These matches, the ashtray, and these matches, and the remote control, and the paddle ball. This lamp. I don't need one other thing. Not one. I need this.
We get out and shut the door. We lock the door. We make a mental note to tell our friend about the detour so she can plan a better route. Once we do all that, the drive really comes to an end. Here's a little diagram I made to remind me of the 5 steps of progress. On the left is an eye. It reminds me of the mind's eye that we use to visualize what we want or where we want to be. It also reminds me of our physical eyes, which we use to examine the reality around us. On the right side is a stop sign shape with the word end inside. It reminds me that when we achieve our goal, it's not enough to simply stop. We also need to end things properly. We need to shut everything down in an orderly manner. We need to pack everything up and put it all away. We need to remember the journey and what we learned, and we need to record those lessons and pass them on to others. Between the beginning, where we see what we want, and the end, where we get what we want, is a repeating cycle of planning, acting, and steering. Planning, acting, and steering. We start by making the best plan we can, and we act on it. But inevitably, things happen that we couldn't have predicted, and we have to steer in a different direction. Sometimes we have to drive further than we expected, or faster than we expected, or drive more carefully in some places. Sometimes we need to make a new plan. Then we act on the new plan. Then other things happen and we have to steer around those things. This cycle can occur over and over. But if we don't give up, if we keep going, if we are determined to get to our goal, very often we will get there. We may be a little later than we'd hoped. We may have gone to a few places we hadn't planned on, but we are there, and it's time to end the trip. Now we get to have some more fun. I'd like to show you 5 more amazing projects. And these 5 remind me of the 5 steps of progress. Just like with the first 5 projects I showed you in the previous video, all of these projects contain all 5 parts of a project, and they all had to go through all 5 of the steps. But for various reasons, each one of these projects just happens to remind me of one of the steps. Are you ready? Let's go. Imagine for a moment you are on the plateau of Giza more than 5,000 years ago. You're just in time to see the project leader lay down the very first course of blocks for the Great Pyramid. You notice that some of these huge blocks of stone have been carefully shaped at a very specific angle. You realize that this is not going to be an ordinary building. It's not going to look like a big cube. It's going to get smaller and smaller as it gets taller and taller and taller. You imagine that at some point, way, way, way up there, the 4 sides are going to come together in a point. You have no idea how high it will get or what it will look like at the top. But the project leader does. He knows exactly what the pyramid will look like when it's finished. In fact, he can't lay down the first course of stones without knowing exactly how many courses there will be and exactly how tall it will be. The way a pyramid is constructed requires the builder to know exactly what it will ultimately look like from the very moment it begins to take shape. The outside of every block on the facing stones has to have the exact right angle. Every one of them has to be pointing directly to the eventual point where all 4 sides will come together. But the project leader knew exactly where the top would be. He could see it clearly, and he could clearly see in his mind's eye every course of stones that would be required between the bottom and the top. That's why the Giza pyramids remind me of the first step, C. Hey, maybe that's why the founding fathers put a pyramid on the back of the dollar bill. They even put an eye on top. I think they must have had something like the same idea in their minds. And he could see all the rooms and passageways that were required to be in the middle of the pyramid. Here's the so-called King's Chamber, where Kent and I spent the night. The project leader must have clearly seen that chamber from the very beginning. And Kent and I could very clearly see ourselves sleeping in it for a full year before we did it. And we could clearly see what equipment and supplies we would need, and clearly see how we would get there. The first step of progress toward a goal is to visualize the goal as already accomplished. You have to see it. Now, to explore the second step of progress, let's travel to the opposite side of the planet, to a steamy jungle in Peru. It's 1450, and Chris Columbus hasn't even been born yet. So the people in the Western Hemisphere are enjoying their last century of self-determination before the brutal European invasion. The Inca Empire was just starting to expand under the wise leadership of one of its greatest rulers. Pakakudi. Pakakudi was smart. He would use military might, but only as a last resort. First, he would send emissaries to the neighboring kingdoms and learn what they had and what they needed. Then he sent friendly messages to the kings and showered them with lavish gifts. He showed them how their people would be better off, much better off, if they joined with him. He was incredibly successful, and he amassed great power and wealth. And as a little reward for himself, he had a modest summer home built for himself and his family up in the mountains where it's cooler and has a real nice view. They had about 750 servants too, and today we call it Machu Picchu. We don't know who the project leader was, but they obviously understood the second step of progress: plan. You can see how steep and irregular the terrain is around here. But the project leader knew they needed a very flat, stable foundation on which to build. That required a lot of planning. But it would take more than 500 years to discover just how much planning was done. When Machu Picchu was rediscovered by Hiram Bingham in 1911, no one really knew how it was built or any of the details of the construction. I don't know if anyone even bothered to ask those sorts of questions. But in the 1970s, engineer Kenneth Wright and his wife Ruth became very interested in Machu Picchu, and they've studied it extensively. They've estimated that 60% of the construction there is actually hidden below the ground. It's this elaborate foundation and drainage system that keeps everything in place. Without it, the heavy rains would wash the whole thing away. The leader of that project planned ahead and put a lot of thought into the foundation. This is also known as risk management. That's why Machu Picchu reminds me of the second step of progress: plan. To explore the third step, we have to go back to the other side of the world again, but this time to an exotic land about 3,000 miles further away than the pyramids. And this time we aren't visiting an empire that's just beginning to expand, but one at its very peak. It was called the Mughal Empire, and it was in its golden age in 1630. For a few hundred years, it occupied all the land from southern India to Afghanistan, and it was over 3,000 miles wide. Its leader at that time was Shah Jahan, and he was a very competent military commander, but he was best known for his love of architecture. Step number 3 is act. So let's talk about an act of true love. Shah Jahan had a very beautiful wife named Mumtaz, and he loved her very, very much. I think I know how he felt. They had 13 children together and were blissfully happy. When she found herself with child for the 14th time, I have to assume they were delighted. But this time, it didn't go as well as before. And Mumtaz died giving birth. Shah Jahan was devastated with grief. To honor her, he asked his chief architect, Ahmed Lahari, to build her the most fabulous tomb the world had ever seen. Cost was no object, so the project leader spent 32 million rupees, which would be about $900 million today. As a comparison, Princess Diana's funeral only cost about $6.3 million. JFK's funeral cost about $40 million. And Ronald Reagan's funeral cost a whopping $400 million. But Shah Jahan spent more than twice as much. Ahmed Lahari hired 22,000 workers and artisans to construct it, and 1,000 elephants to move the materials around. He spent 12 years to build the tomb itself, and another 10 years constructing a mosque, a guest house, other outbuildings, formal gardens, and a beautiful reflecting pool. The result is the Taj Mahal, often called the most beautiful building in the world. It was built using precious materials from all over, including white marble from Rajasthan, Tibetan turquoise, sapphire from Sri Lanka, Arabian carnelian, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and jade and crystal from China. A true act of love, built by the axe of 22,000 skilled workers and 1,000 elephants, a team of architects, and one very skilled project leader. I remember this very clearly. It was the summer of 1969, and I had just finished my freshman year of high school. On the evening of July 20, I was wandering around my neighborhood, looking for love in all the wrong places, apparently. So I called it a night, went home, switched on our ancient black and white TV, and I saw this happen. And then I heard this.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
That small step that Neil Armstrong took reminds me of the fourth step of progress, which is steer. It's been said many times that an airliner is off course 90% of the time. It's true. Most pilots prefer to fly manually during takeoff and landing. But for 90% of the flight, the autopilot is on. And when the autopilot is on, it's adjusting the flight controls almost continuously. Now, if that is true for a coast-to-coast flight from DC to LA, you would expect a lot more course corrections to be made during the flight from the Earth to the Moon, wouldn't you? I would, but I'd be wrong. It is astonishing to me that during the 250,000-mile flight to the Moon, the spacecraft only fired its rocket a few times. It's like we threw a dart at a dartboard and hit a very specific spot on the bullseye, except the dartboard is 18 inches in diameter and less than 8 feet away from the thrower. At that distance, a dartboard looks to be about as big as your fist is when it's an arm's length away from your eyes. And the Moon appears to be about as big as an aspirin held at an arm's length away. Well, that's a huge difference. And again, when you play darts, the dartboard is less than 8 feet away. The Moon is 250,000 miles away. That's about 30 Earth diameters, or 80 times further than from DC to LA. So it was a really good shot. For most of the flight, The Apollo astronauts didn't actually have to steer. Their plan was exceptionally good, and it was very, very well executed. But when the lunar lander went down to the moon's surface, there was a lot of steering. When they neared the moon's surface, Neil Armstrong looked out the window and he was shocked to see dozens of large boulders and a huge 300-foot crater right where they had expected a very smooth landing area. So he took manual control of the lunar lander and flew past the intended landing zone. They were now 107 feet above the surface and knew they had a very limited supply of propellant. If they used too much or took too long, they would have to either abort the moon landing altogether or risk being stuck on the moon with no hope of rescue. The next good landing site also had a large crater. Armstrong had to manually fly past that one also, and they now had only 90 seconds of fuel left to spare. As they got closer to the moon's surface, they started to kick up a lot of moon dust, which cut their visibility. But Armstrong could see some large rocks jutting up through the dust cloud, and he used those to judge their speed. They got a low fuel warning, but had to keep going. Another warning light indicated a glancing contact with the surface, but still they continued on for 3 more seconds until finally the lunar lander was safely on the moon's surface, and only then could Armstrong shut down the engines. Their onboard computer reported they only had enough extra fuel for 25 more seconds of flight before they would have had to abort, but they made it. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin had just achieved the first half of the most far-out project ever attempted by mankind. They had steered a spaceship all the way from the Earth to the moon and landed it safely. Now, all they had to do was get back home again. Whether you're driving to work, leading a large project, or landing a spacecraft on the surface of the moon, you have to very carefully steer almost continuously. I mentioned this next project in the first video of this series, but I'd like to talk about it again now as an example of the 5th step of progress. For over 25 years, I ran a youth leadership academy at Monmouth University in New Jersey. The unique result of this project was a 4-day training event, and at the very end of this annual event, we held a celebration for the 180 high school students who had attended and for their parents. At the end of the celebration, the 65 staff members would gather on stage to be recognized and thanked for all their hard work. All of that work was done by volunteers. No one was paid for any of it. Then the participants and their parents would leave the campus and drive home. Meanwhile, we would stay to pack up and put away all the equipment and supplies we needed for the event, so everything would be ready for us to do it again the next year. And then the next day, the senior staff gathered again to talk about what they had learned during that year's project and what they might do better the following year. They often generated a list containing hundreds of ideas and suggestions for future improvements. We would study those lists and discuss them, and then implement the best ideas. For 25 years, they held those sessions to record what had gone well, what we had learned, and how it could be even better. And for 25 years, the program got better and better each year. After my son, Jamie, it's the thing I'm most proud of in my life. So it was a great shock to all of us when our funding was withdrawn. A lot of people assumed that that would be the end of our Youth Leadership Academy. But the day after Thanksgiving, 2019. The senior staff got together again for 2 days of intense soul searching and brainstorming, and they unanimously decided to continue the Leadership Academy that they had spent 25 years developing, to form their own nonprofit educational organization, to find their own funding, to steer their own course into the future. And they proudly formed Torch Leadership Academy. Now that's how you end a project the right way. There you have the 5 projects that remind me of the 5 steps of progress, and the last of Dave's top 10 list of amazing projects. So, one more time, the 5 steps are: see, plan, act, steer, end. If you make a matrix grid with the 5 parts of a project down the left axis and the 5 steps of progress across the top axis, you can fill in each of the 25 intersections with a specific type of task you need to do on your project. For example, the intersection of the what part with the C step is describe the vision. This would be a detailed description of the end result of the project. And the intersection of the when part with the C step is fixed deadlines, which includes the planned project finish date, as well as any important milestones you expect to reach along the way. For most projects, you'll need to at least consider each of these 25 types of tasks. I'll put a link to this file in the description below, so you can download it for yourself if you want. In the final video of this series, I'll share some friendly advice for project leaders. These are the 7 most effective pieces of advice I've learned through the years, and I'm confident they'll help you with your projects, not to mention all the other areas of your life, as much as they've helped me. And with the world as it is now, I really believe we all need to try to help each other as much as we can. Don't you think? I hope you enjoyed learning about the 5 steps of progress and exploring 5 more amazing projects with me. Thanks for watching and have a super great day.